Hello and good afternoon to those of you joining us on Zoom and those of you in the room. One last time, welcome. Today's the second day, and this is the last event in Making Up Selves, the operating instructions. I'm smiling because we have competition from a very festive university. Hopefully we can build on that energy without being too distracted, right? I'm going to take just a minute to thank our sponsors before opening the floor up to my dear colleague Michael Sheehy, who will introduce my dear friend Niki Clements to close off our session. I want to acknowledge the generous support of our co-sponsors, the University of Virginia Democracy Initiatives, Religion, Race and Democracy Lab, the Page Barber Funds, and I want to thank all of you who are present and have been present over these 2 days, and a particularly warm thank you to my students and the students of the University of Virginia for being such an excellent audience. Housekeeping notes, in-person audience, please silence your phones, though that seems a tad bit redundant. So perhaps I should say don't bop along too obviously. We are videotaping this event. It's synced to our Zoom live stream, and one of the coolest house parties I've heard at UVA in a little while. There will be time for Q&A to field questions, as well as from Zoom. Online audience members, please post your questions in the Q&A box. We'll do our best to incorporate them into the program. It's been a singular treat. I don't know how to put this in words, but the point of this workshop was to stimulate conversation across disciplines. I hope that you've found that this has happened. I certainly have learned a lot. So I don't know if I'll get a chance to say this at the end, but thank you to all our speakers, all our guests, and thank you to every single person in this room for really modeling what humanities in conversation without reviewer number 2 present in the room can be. And now I invite Michael Sheehy to introduce our last and final speaker. Thanks, Mike.
Hello, everyone. So in the Tibetan tradition, there's a practice called Nyamsu Len, which means integrated into experience. So this is a sort of, opportunity for integration, shall we say. I have the distinct pleasure today of introducing a remarkable scholar. Professor Niki Kasumi Clements is the Wat J. and Lily G. Jackson Assistant Professor of Religion, and the Allison Safram Assistant Professor of Distinguished Teaching in the Humanities in the Department of Religion at Rice University. Niki was a dancer, and if I understand correctly, spent much of her early life in the San Francisco Bay Area dancing with her sisters, training as a pre-professional ballerina. Now she brings her embodied sensibilities, her performativity, if you will, to her work in religious studies, to religious ethics and practices, asking questions about how we shape ourselves as humans, and in so doing, traversing and defying normative boundaries of the self and the body. Professor Clements brings an embodied knowledge, the fruition of her years of academic training at Sarah Lawrence College, Harvard Divinity School, and Brown University, where she studied philosophy of religion, religious ethics, Michel Foucault's modern critical theory, Christianity and Late-Antiquity, but also, if I may dare suggest, a knowledge embodied by her, perhaps influenced by her years of training as a ballerina. I first learned of Niki through a talk that she gave at a symposium hosted by the Mind and Life Institute in 2016. Her talk was based on a somewhat obscure series of lectures delivered at the University di Bologna in Italy by the late Chilean biologist and cybernetician Francisco Varela, who is one of my all-time personal intellectual heroes. These Varela lectures were published as Ethical Know-How, Action, Wisdom, and Cognition. And in these transcripts, as Professor Clements articulated in her talk, Varela lays out a theoretical framework, a kind of sweeping architecture for contemplative practices in the neuroscience of embodied cognition. These lectures built on work that connects cognition with embodiment, but extends these ideas into the realm of ethics, a domain where Professor Clements feels utterly at home. In her talk, she goes on to link Varela's neuroscientific theoretical work on embodiment in action with the ethical thought of the late antique Catholic John Cassian. I remember meeting up with Niki in the hallways of another conference not too long after that lecture and asking her, casually in person, wanting to learn more from her. And as I did, her face lit up. She reached into her bag. She pulled out her copy of Ethical Know-How, which she had with her, as if she traveled everywhere with it. Ah! She unfurled it in front of me like a fan, and in so doing, my eyes caught a glimpse of the interlinear markup and the marginalia, and now the yellow highlighter in neon throughout the pages, and annotations that rivaled the text on the page itself. And at that moment, I knew we would be friends. Her first monograph, Sights of the Aesthetic Self, John Cassian and Early Christian Ethical Formation, published by Notre Dame Press in 2020, is a study of the late 4th and early 5th century Catholic architect of Latin monasticism, who was marginalized for what Professor Clements calls his optimistic views of human agency. Through surviving works of Cassian, she envisions contemporary debates about ethics and subjectivity, drawing on conversations about extreme asceticism endured by the desert elders. A central theme running throughout her book, and it seems more broadly throughout her work, are tensions inherent between the practices we perform and the experiences we embody. She explores bodily practices of eating and sleeping and labor, affective practices of meditatio, recitation, and memorization of scripture, communal practices of emulating and proximate and distal aesthetic exercises which engage critical reflection. Such cultivation techniques require ongoing engagement with the body, with the emotions, with attention. She relates these to Foucault's discourses on asceticism for its ethical potential to contest power. Tracing this arc from the practices of late antiquity to Foucault's technologies of the self, she situates the importance of practices to perform on one's own body in order to transform. Her recent archival research on Foucault's practices of the self in antiquity at the Bibliothèque nationale de France builds on this work. I've only heard about it anecdotally, and we are so very, very fortunate to have her here today to discuss this and her most recent work on Foucault. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Niki Kasumi Clements.
Thank you, Michael. It's really a beautiful honor, as well as a true joy to meet people serendipitously in the world, people who are your heroes, people whose work you've read, people who have inspired you since you were a baby graduate student, and to call them your people. Forging these little temporary communities and collectives is something that I think is really a part of the possibilities we have together in the humanities and in broader humanity. And it's such a delight to be here with everyone, to hear my own work synthesized by Michael in this way. Gives me hope that I actually have something to say. So I'm grateful for that. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the people who are funding this, the Religion Lab, Religion Democracy, and Race Lab, the Page and Barber Funds, of course, Ashley, Duffalo. Every meticulous detail has been planned. And Jason, my wonderful tech coordinator. So thank you. In terms of the practice of the self, actual 5-year plan as I understand it. It's been really incredible to see the way in which Sonam and Janet and Ivana and Andre have been putting together something that is so interdisciplinary, so methodologically rich, and so oriented in a shared ethos towards what it means to do this kind of scholarship, but in a critical and engaged way. I see this modeled in your students. You're amazing. It's really wonderful to hear where you're coming from and where you're going, and it's a singular pleasure to be a part of your little community for these couple days. A special thank you to Tanya Lerman and Sarah Johnston for just really illuminating so much over the last couple days, as well as in the longer term through their own work. It's really incredible to be in conversation with people whose work I admire so much. And finally to Sonam Kashru, who's been a dear friend since 2004 when we were baby graduate students at HDS. A little miserable, but full of, of integrity and energy, and desperate to find a way to make ourselves selves in these worlds. So I thank you all for being here. We have some competition, as Sonam was saying. We might have to all stand up. We might have some remixes. We might have DJ Kasumi, which was one of my alter egos in the past, come back. I can't promise anything, but I can say that if I am not speaking loudly enough, if I'm speaking too quickly, just stop me. If you end up having questions throughout, I'm happy to break from my much more traditional script, unfortunately, than our beautiful last two more sweeping and conversational papers. So if the philosophy gets too much, just stop me and I'll just speak, okay? No matter what, today, we're here to talk about practices of self, forms of making ourselves in communities, and I'm doing so in relation to the work of Michel Foucault. I start with my own little confession, which is that I mistitled the talk. I thought I would be talking about Foucault in Late-Antiquity, but it turns out that in order to talk about practices of self, I had to actually go deeper back into antiquity, and so it's no longer just late. We're just going to synthesize it all into his late work on ethics. Between 1974 and 1978, Foucault gravitates towards practices of self in his genealogical turn to Western antiquity. Genealogy, as Foucault defines it, is a history of our present. Yet Foucault comes to the genealogy of the desiring subject far from practices of the self and forms of self-making through an analysis of modern subject formation, shaped through technologies of domination in the 19th century Europe and their antecedents in 16th through 18th century Catholic confession. As Foucault investigates technologies, he turns his historical gaze back to the 4th century of Christian late antiquity and then to Roman imperial and ancient Greek forms of life. Practices of the self, as he makes these methodological turns, become increasingly important to Foucault in this genealogical stretch into antiquity. Now, Foucault's intellectual shifts have surprised readers since the 80s. Basically, when volumes 2 and 3 came out in 1984, right before he died, people were wondering what happened to their great philosopher of power, right? This edgy dude who is out there living large and basically redefining a certain kind of French intellectual scene, all of a sudden turns to antiquity, to texts, to philology, to ethics. All of the claims of neoliberalism have some kind of basis in reality, but it's only a some kind. The recent publication of Foucault's secret 4th volume in the history of sexuality, it's called Confessions of the Flesh, is important because it was in the Fonds Foucault. It was basically within the archive under lock and key since his death in 1984. This secret 4th volume had been published then in an edition in 2018 by Frédéric Gaux, and then finally translated into English only last year. So after 34 years, 38 years, we finally have the final Foucault. Or, I'm going to say, so we thought. My plan this hour is twofold. First, to sketch how Foucault comes to practices of self through his massive reworking of the History of Sexuality series, notably through this last book on Christianity, which ends up being a very strange fulcrum for him. Second, and hopefully this applies more broadly beyond people who don't want to use Foucault as such, to situate the analytical tools of technologies, hermeneutics, and practices of self in relation to Foucault's increased attention to ethical formation, especially in his last 4 years. I'll here discuss an even more unknown monograph by Foucault on ancient ethics. My hope is to frame what this means for how we take these tools up and to form them to our own uses today, both within and beyond the philosophy of religion. So I begin with the last monograph that Foucault develops, a book on ancient ethics and care of the self. Amidst the 100+ boxes of Foucault's archives at the Bibliothèque nationale de France, 3 of them constitute a set named Government of Self and Others. Right? It's Le Gouvernement de Soi et des Autres. I've been doing extensive work within the archives at the BNF. They're crazy American transcribing, trying to make sense of a very wide swath of his work, in part because his question of Christianity and the question of method is something that I'm both deeply invested in and was shocked to learn that he was continuously changing his own mind about. You might recognize this title, Government of Self and Others, from the last 2 series of lectures that Foucault gives in 1983 and 84 at the Collège de France. The archival inventory at the BNF indicates that the handwritten manuscripts found in these 3 boxes were written around the same time. And as I detail later in this talk, I have a provisional sense of the book's order in 2 parts. Most germane to our own symposium, the first part, L'art de soi-même, the art of oneself, has 2 sub-chapters, so big chapters for Foucault. La culture de soi, the culture of self, and 2, les pratiques de soi, the practices of self. Daniel Defer, the partner of Foucault, shared how at the very end of his life, Foucault had declared this entire volume completely drafted and ready to be edited. It was also going to be published with Edition de Seuil, and so what do we have then but a secret final Foucault? So what is this mysterious volume on ancient ethics? And how does it connect to Foucault's 1984 pursuit of ethics as care of the self as a practice of freedom? To answer this question requires a bit of context on Foucault's other last monograph and the movements of his thought over his last decade. When Foucault's draft, Confessions of the Flesh, was posthumously published in 2018, this 4th and final volume was declared the secret final key to Foucault. However, this volume did little to actually shift the vertigo that readers had experienced when reading volumes 2 and 3 upon Foucault's death in 1984. This 8-year span then, from 1976 to 1984, saw methodological, conceptual, and textual shifts for Foucault. Most schematically, he moves through analyses of power relations and discursive practices, the things that he is most known for. Foucault is still the #1 cited person in the entire world in all of scholarship. Discipline and Punish is the most cited of all of his works. So he's relevant whether we like it or not, and that Foucault on power is not only relevant, but it's continuously cited, and in this iterative process, of course, reinforces a certain kind of view of Foucault, and a view that he himself would be very opposed to, right, as ossified and fixed and only the philosopher of power. He himself also contained multitudes. What I find most interesting is as he's moving through these questions of power, he increasingly turns to the capacity that selves also have to shape themselves. So this person who has diagnosed so effectively how subjects are shaped, that he's so cited for, realizes, as he says in 1982 at the University of Vermont in his Technologies of Self lecture, perhaps I had insisted too much on the technologies of power and domination. In any case, I have more and more been brought to interest myself in technologies of the self. Instead of negating his work on power, then, Foucault frames here 4 interoperating forms of technology that I'll return to below. Technologies of domination, yes, but also technologies of production, of signification, and here, of the self. Over the last 4 years of his life, then, Foucault forges an ethos resonant with Ursula Le Guin's epigraph for our own symposium. She says, all of us have to learn how to invent our lives, make them up, imagine them. We need to be taught these skills. We need guides to show us how. If we don't, our lives get made up for us by other people. As Foucault had proffered diagnostics for carceral society in his 1975 Discipline and Punish, he forged analytics of power and knowledge that remain relevant, even after decades. And yet these accounts of how subjects are shaped contribute to an intractable sense of how our lives get made up for us. In a draft of his Ancient Ethics book, by contrast, Foucault unfolds how we are under the power of another, but it is here where the work on ourselves must intervene. We must protect ourselves from all these inevitable misfortunes and become conscious that we are not reducible to the things that constitute our status. I mean, sounds very un-Foucauldian. I also brought in the Foucault with hair for the graduate students. Special request. So how, given these conditions of becoming subject in disciplinary society, can we learn to invent our lives? How, given these conditions, Foucault himself tries to come to articulate the conditions for invention without falling into a binary of freedom of the subject or determinism of the subject. Instead, he elaborates 3 axes as constitutive of human experience, where ethics operates as a 3rd axis alongside knowledge and power. And Foucault gradually identifies the technologies of self as a self-shaping capacity, yet all subjects are already constituted by a historical a priori and now within disciplinary societies. He doesn't take backsies, as people have asked me before, really. Amy Hollywood, actually, last week. So in 1983, he ties together the forms of knowledge with the practices of behavior with pragmatics of self. And in his last year of lectures, 1984, Foucault even sweepingly declares connecting together modes of erudition, technologies of governmentality, and practices of the self is basically what I've always been trying to do. So for someone who's deeply unsystematizing, it's pretty illuminating. Over his last decade, then, we can trace how Foucault gradually becomes fascinated with an understanding of ethics not about code-based morality and submissive rule following, but as enabling robust forms of resistance to modes of domination and subjection in carceral society. Now, some confusion attends Foucault's ethics because of readers' assumptions that ethics is conflated with moral prescription and imposition of what we ought to do. Ethics here needs to be differentiated then from morality as adherence to a code of rules or the deontological operations of moral judgment. In a late interview, Foucault notes, "From antiquity to Christianity, we pass from a morality that was essentially the search for a personal ethics to a morality as obedience to a system of rules. And if I was interested in antiquity, it was because for a whole series of reasons, the idea of morality as obedience to a code of rules is now disappearing, has already disappeared. And to this absence of morality must correspond, the search for an aesthetics of existence." So we see here how Foucault disdains morality as obedience, and he analyzes the force of ancient personal ethics. And yet this is not a neoliberal flight from the socialists, but rather a way of recognizing subject formation as prerequisite to forging an art of living. With the erosion of code-based morality, Foucault draws towards alternative forms of ethics and ways of life. This is him in Death Valley on his notorious LSD trip with Simeon Wade. It's very sweet, their friendship actually. He poignantly engages a contemporary version of a search for an aesthetics of existence with reference to the texts of Greek and Roman antiquity considers as sources for thinking through, not, I stress, reappropriating or somehow retrieving or adopting, how personal ethics takes the form of a self-relation. As we'll see, however, Foucault's articulation of this post-individualizing ethical formation emerges in a tight dialectic with his engagement with the history of Christianity. In his search for resistance to modern disciplinary society, he first uses Catholicism as a cipher for punitive society. However, as he traced the archives of texts and put into context early Christian religious thought and practices, he comes to some of his most important theoretical breaks with modernity. So how did Foucault genealogically trace these changes? Well, in his telling, this personal ethics mutates into a morality in Christianity based on compulsory obedience to authority and a code of rules, right? This is prison. Society is prison, et cetera, et cetera. And this is where Foucault's complicated relation to the history of Christianity extends into a reformulation of his entire History of Sexuality series, which he begins in 1974 and not quite completes in 1984. So in his 1976, Volume 1, History of Sexuality, known in English as an introduction, in French, La Volonté de Savoir, Foucault announces the History of Sexuality series as having 6 volumes total. The other 5 volumes would then be The Flesh and the Body, The Children's Crusade, On Hysterical Women, on perverts, and on populations. Volumes 3 through 6 then would treat the four main strategies for normalizing sexuality in 19th century psychiatric, medical, and social practices: children, women, queer men, and racialized populations. Volume 2 then would be dedicated to 17th and 18th century confessional practices in the Catholic pastoral as well as the Reformed pastoral. There's more Martin Luther in the archives than we would have thought, exposing the religious roots of truth-telling, as we talked about yesterday, notably of one's sexual desires that would come to regulate carceral society. None of these 5 volumes would be completed. However, the Foucault archives at the BNF hold a surprising number of chapters that I join Philippe Chevalier, Frédéric Cosse, and others in considering drafted for huge swaths of volumes 2 and 3. With significant material on masturbation and the confession of sins of La Lecture, Foucault's focus in these volumes directly ties to the production of sexuality and the battle against onanism in particular, right, the fight against masturbation. The material for Volume 2, The Flesh and the Body, and Volume 3, The Children's Crusade, overlap in Foucault's treatment of manuals for the good confessor in the direction of conscience and penitence. Basically, he goes through all of these different confessional manuals where the confessor is constantly being trained on how to ask questions and elicit the right kinds of confessions, how to categorize sins, and basically it just becomes a list of imagined as opposed to actual practices. And so we don't actually learn about what's happening. And this is a kind of dissatisfaction that Philippe Chevalier comes to in terms of how he reads Foucault, becoming dissatisfied with these theoretical manuals, and so in turn trying to figure out what the practices are, what's actually happening, what are the experiences like, not what are the pervy people who are writing these manuals actually thinking and imagining. By January 1977, there's a German translation of Volume 1, and Foucault here has already retitled Volume 2, the Christian book, as Les Aveux de la Chair, Confessions of the Flesh. So it used to be The Flesh and the Body, it's now Confessions of the Flesh. He then keeps this title even as he transforms his planned 6-volume series on modern constructions of sexuality into his published 4-volume series on ancient sexual ethics. Confessions of the Flesh remains the title of Foucault's Christian book. He literally calls it his Christian book, even as the volume takes form in at least 3 different versions, focusing on different epochs in Western history and foregrounding different problematics. In an insert to his 1984 Volume 2, The Use of Pleasure, Foucault describes the forthcoming and final volume in his History of Sexuality series. He says, Confessions of the Flesh will deal finally with the experience of the flesh in the first centuries of Christianity and with the role played in it by the hermeneutic and purifying decipherment of desire, purity. Foucault's death would preclude the completion of his edits for Volume 4 and the planned publication, in fact, October of that very year. We learn from this insert that Foucault anticipated a text on the experience of the flesh, the hermeneutics of the subject, and the purifying analysis of desire in early Christian experience, notably from Clement of Alexandria up through Augustine of Hippo. While Volume 2 and Volume 3 were published in the months before Foucault's death in 1984, Foucault was in the process of hand-editing the typescripts of Confessions of the Flesh in these same months. Confessions would complete the history of sexuality in the form of 4 volumes engaging sexual ethics from pagan antiquity to Christian late antiquity. The sexuality series comes to a belated apogee nearly 4 decades later, with the History of Sexuality Volume 4 now out from the vaults and into public circulation. In this tale, then, of 2 histories of sexuality, what might have been a quick excursus into early modern Catholic confession with the flesh and the body, anticipating the kind of psychiatric encounter that we talked about yesterday in terms of the water torture, becomes instead Foucault's decade-long wrestling with the history of Christianity, subjectivity, and governmentality, gradually pushing back Confessions of the Flesh to Volume 4 from that Volume 2. Foucault basically writes this Christian book in the background of all the others in the series. So Foucault does not simply delay Volume 2. It's this constant deferral of the Christian question that in fact gives us what the history of sexuality became. Chapter versions that I believe Foucault wrote for Confessions of the Flesh move from 16th century accounts of counter-Reformation confessional practices to the 13th century sacramentalization of confession, the way back to the 4th and 5th century monastic practices of spiritual direction. So the version of Confessions of the Flesh, as recently published, does not settle the matter, as it remains a very polished draft that Foucault established as a workable reduction of the sprawling material he produced around Christianity as he worked on the series. Now what we have here, we have so Philippe Chevalier gave a marvelous talk last year in this virtual series on Foucault's Confessions, and basically there are a couple different versions of this second volume on Christianity that we've been able to kind of trace out in the archives. So there are full chapter drafts of all of these within the archives, and in the process of trying to work this out into a more public forum maybe. So that was the first version. Second, if you want to know this stuff later, I will let you know. Any questions at this stage? Does everyone just want to stand up and have a dance party? I feel like we need to actually embody something more forcefully.
Why were they finding release from books?
In order to prevent the Foucault archives from being bought, probably by some American university, France declared the archives a national treasure, which meant that they could only be kept within the boundaries of France, which is why they sold it to the BNF. It was sold to the BNF in 2013, and then it's been in the process of being inventoried, but it's an ongoing process. It's very complicated, challenging, and there are a lot of just errors because he wasn't very systematic. He was really pulling from all over, and he was constantly basically remixing his ideas and his volumes, and that's pretty much that's the only upshot to take away from today. Foucault is constantly in the process of sampling and bringing things back in, especially on Christianity and especially on these questions of ethics. So that kind of aliveness in his own mind, right? The desire to stay open to what the text can teach him, that way of thinking through methodologies that seem really dated at this stage, but he actually realized that historical methodologies were actually at the heart of some of the most interesting philosophical and theoretical thinking. So this is why I'm Team Foucault. Anyone else? Okay. How is volume? Okay. Oh, then you can hear. Okay, thank you. I know. I told Sonoma I might do the Running Man. Maybe now that I've been outed as an ex-ballerina, I'll have to actually have some skills. I invite you all to get up and move around. I won't take it personally. So part 2, we move then from technologies to practices of self. Basically, this is how roughly technologies, in his work on power, hermeneutics, more power, opening onto practices as really the site of thinking through ethics. So as he's moving through these axes, he's also refining his own analytics. Foucault moves from technologies to hermeneutics to practices of self in concert with his changing understandings of late ancient Christian practice. Foucault's posthumously published draft of Confessions of the Flesh now invites us to parse the technologies of self from the hermeneutics of desire, from the practices of self, through shifts from planned to realized framings of the volume. I'll state how Foucault develops these 3 tools here, both for how they contribute to Foucault's own genealogy of modern subjectivity and how they might contribute to analyses of materials and traditions well beyond the scope of the Western narratives included in Foucault's own history of his present. I consider this a task for and through the philosophy of religion. Sonam Kashu is another exemplary person working within this kind of domain, at least I'll adopt you. No longer a parochial discipline of using philosophical tools to argue theological positions, but philosophy of religion is seeing how philosophical constructions emerge in a wrestling with and in religious contexts. Basically, philosophy taking religion seriously. So I sketch how Foucault moves from technologies to hermeneutics to practices in order to set the stage for one more twist in Foucault's Bibliothèque, a move he makes in teasing out technologies and practices as a means of developing liberatory potentials in ethics. It's well known that Foucault becomes attentive to the technologies of self as a central category of analysis in his 1982 lectures at the University of Vermont, as I referred to earlier, and his 1984 Histories of Sexuality, Volume 2 and 3. Jeremy Corrette has long noted that, quote, the final volume of Foucault's history of sexuality as located in techniques of the self and ethics, and we can now see this ourselves in volume 4. Foucault's lectures at Berkeley and Dartmouth in 1980 engaged technologies of self as important tools and the forms by which subjects are shaped in different times and contexts. There are also, however, unpublished drafts in the BNF archives that show Foucault directly yoking the technologies of self and the ethical back in 1980. I believe the earliest appearance of technologies of self in the published records is 1981 at the Collège de France, where Foucault describes how, quote, through this technology, the possibility and necessity emerges of a relationship with the aphrodisia, the sexual acts, which will not appear as just a class of acts, but as a specific aspect, a dimension of the individual, a permanent relationship of himself to himself. Before the 80s, Foucault uses the language of technologies without referring to self in his most cited work, Discipline and Punish, where basically he's talking about technologies of power, agronomical, industrial, economic technologies, and most strikingly, the corrective techniques of the individual. In preparation for Discipline and Punish, Foucault had been researching penal practices, basically from 1971 through 1974. And this is where he ends up using technologies as a synonym for techniques, but both terms indicated strategies and practices oriented towards the ends of control and management. Replacing techniques of sovereign force and violence, disciplinary techniques such as, quote, timetables, collective training, exercises, total and detailed surveillance, end quote, become just as important as the means of capitalist production. It's interesting to me that Foucault finishes writing Discipline and Punish in 1974, the very same day that he starts History of Sexuality, Volume 1, which itself includes references to technologies of power, new technologies of sex, and technologies become important because Foucault stresses how techniques of knowledge and strategies of power are always linked together. If you recall the structure for the first plan of the History of Sexuality series, there are 6 volumes and drafted chapters. For the second volume, elaborate Foucault's treatment of Catholic confession as a local center for a technology for shaping individuals and devising their behaviors. We can see in Foucault's developing analysis of ancient Western philosophical and religious texts how technologies of self are neither necessarily liberatory nor necessarily critical of existing power relations. In a 1983 interview, Foucault claims his draft of the History of Sexuality, Volume 4, deals with Christian technologies of the self, while Volumes 2 and 3 on Greek and Roman sexual ethics treat ancient pagan technologies of the self. He analyzes the differences between ancient Greek, Roman, and early Christian sexual ethics through this 4-fold table. So you can roughly see here how he's identifying the different folds in the technologies. You have to identify the ethical substance. You have to submit yourself to a certain kind of rule and regulation. You have certain practices, and you have a certain kind of goal or orientation. So it's a very useful analytic that can be applied in many different ways, I think. I think that his own diagnosis in these texts and contexts is just wrong, but he gets worse as he moves that way because he really wants his genealogy to meet up with modernity. And that's like pretty much why I think things go haywire. But it's really interesting because he's really trying to figure out what are the differences as well as the continuities. And here, as he's developing these understandings of sexual ethics foregrounding pleasure and moderation with the ancient Greeks in Volume 2, which is better, and care of the self in order to attain self-mastery, Romans Volume 3, yes, however, the way he does it is kind of weird, and obedience to divine law that requires the interpretation and renunciation of the self and desire in Volume 4. And that's where things, I think, really go haywire. Foucault is very critical of the emerging disciplinary apparatus of the Catholic pastorate precisely because subjects are shaped so efficiently that they choose their subjection and manage themselves under the panoptic gaze. As we see in Foucault's analysis of carceral society, the soul might be the prison of the body, but I think we're here for reform. We're here for abolition, not reform. No reform. So what does this mean for how the History of Sexuality series becomes identified with technologies of self? Well, it means that technologies of self are not operating without or beyond forms of power and knowledge. In fall 1980, Foucault writes a draft in preparation for his Berkeley Howison lectures, where he unfolds these technologies. At this juncture, Foucault is still working on his history of confession, now not that of institutions, but rather of what one might call the technologies of self. He continues, And this is in his 1980, he's basically drafting what he'll only say publicly in 1982. And you can read this if you like, I won't turn. So basically what he does is differentiate 4 great technologies. And he's identifying the ways in which production, signification, what's the third? Domination, of course, the classic, and then the self. So at the end, he says, but there are also, I believe, in all societies, whatever they may be, techniques which permit individuals to effect, by their own means, with the help of or under the direction of others, a certain number of operations of their bodies, their souls, their thoughts, their conduct, and in this manner so as to transform themselves, modify themselves, or to attain a certain state of perfection, of happiness, of purity, of enlightenment, etc. So identifying these major matrices of practical reason, which for those who are interested, I think have interesting overlaps with Heidegger as well as Aristotle, Foucault stresses how these 4 types of technology hardly function separately and show at the same time their specific nature and their constant interaction. So it's important that Foucault comes to these technologies of self in relation to his history of confession, as he's pursuing this long genealogy of how we become confessing animals in the modern West. Yesterday I had said that Foucault is obsessed with these 2 questions. Why are we obliged to tell the truth about ourselves? And which truth? What are the truths by which we need to identify ourselves in order to renounce that very self? Confession as domination and signification anticipates those very mechanisms and clearly shows up in Foucault's Le Cher et le Corps, the volume 2, as the opening problematic for 17th and 18th century confessional manuals that in turn set up the logic for 19th century strategies of producing sexuality. Think, for example, of Dr. Leray from yesterday, Charcot and his patients. Confession as technology of self involves the intersection with the other technologies. They must be made to require a certain skill, but in the sense that they must have an attitude towards themselves and towards the environment as well as towards other people, he says. So Foucault is developing these different interoperating technologies. It's really bound up in the way in which he sees Catholicism as a way of institutionalizing domination and subjection, especially through this figure of John Cassian, my friend, who is this late ancient monastic who is not only thinking about how do we live at the end of the world, how do we live in shifting times and times of uncertainty, and how do we live together in those times. Foucault instead sees the kind of preconditions for subjection, obedience, and an institutionalized form of subjection that we feel even today. So I'm going to skip over the hermeneutics section. I think that you will forgive me for that. But I do want to say that there is one thing that's important to note, which is that the kinds of shifts that Foucault is making here is, as I was saying, in conversation, not only with historical texts, but with historians. When he's at Berkeley in 1980, he meets Peter Brown, right, the famed historian of Late-Antiquity. And it's the conversations that they have together, which in so many ways brings to life what they have both been working on separately, and yet they're able to engage, not only with each other, because they didn't actually see each other that often, but it informed both of their trajectories in these ways that I think are really striking and show that any kind of real disciplinary innovations will also require a certain kind of interdisciplinarity, of a shared and collective spirit. Oh, yeah. This is, so this is, yeah. This was another grad student request for a picture of Foucault in his Speedo that apparently Professor Kashu had shared with them at some point. Yeah, right, this must be the one. So this was in Brazil, I believe, and there's a very prominent Heidegger scholar there, and you know, practices of the self take community. This is the conceit of why I put this up there. So practices require communities, it requires people who are coming together very much in the spirit of what we're doing here. And I also forgot to give a shout out to Chuck Matthews back there, who has been an amazing kind of ally in this whole enterprise and made me actually write on the Brown and Foucault connection. So the ways in which these disciplines are constantly engaging each other, I think, is crucial to how we actually get to not only practices as foregrounded, but also how practices are able to bring together so many of the different experiential aspects that can be so self-evident day to day, yet that requires so long to theorize and to finally get to foregrounding. So even like belief, right? Practice had shut out belief, and so how do we actually bring practice and belief and affectivity all back together without negating any of these dimensions of what it is to be human? I think this is part of what Foucault is up to. So as he's engaging, in his Speedo, giving fancy lectures in Brazil, he was lecturing all over the world, he had a really good life. And he's also constantly thinking about cultural differences, different forms of life, different aesthetics of existence, different ways to be other than the way in which, as a child growing up in Vendôme and under the Vichy regime, as a young gay man who had to continuously navigate diagnoses of mental illness and probably voices, and the great existential despair of being displaced, of being forced to conform in ways that were at odds with the ways in which one felt one could be and become. For these reasons, Foucault explores the ethical implications for both the technological and the hermeneutical ambiguities. He's also unfolding possibilities for a critical praxis. He's always thinking about not just what do we think, but what do we do, right? The theoretical and the practical, I think, are really coming together in this praxis, both for some degree of self-shaping as possible and critique as an embedded form of engagement within these games of truth and forms of governmentality, which can thereby challenge subject formation. As technologies of self operate in relation to technologies of domination, signification and production, they don't enable liberation as such. And as hermeneutics of the subject reinforce the constraining and institutionalizing sides of textual and dogmatic interpretation, the possibilities for unfolding the ethical dimensions of human subjection are constrained. So perhaps for this reason, or at the very least in conjunction with this timeline, Foucault comes to identify practices of self as a third category in our operating with games of truth and forms of governmentality. We can see shades of this in Foucault's final monograph, ready to be edited and left in pieces upon his death, yet which remains tantalizingly live in the archives, the volume that I introduced at the very beginning of our talk, The Government of Self and Others. So the link between this final volume and the History of Sexuality series is still not understood. Yet from the archival materials, I think it's possible to glean overlaps between the sexuality series and the ethics volume. Basically, I was not planning on doing this work until next year, but then it turned out that for practices of the self, in order to heed the call for this particular symposium, I was rapidly trying to figure out what was actually happening in Foucault's archives over the last 3 weeks. So this is very hot off the press. And I think it's also exciting. So take this as very provisional, but on the basis of the way in which Foucault designates his works, he's very careful. So it's clear when it's the first part of the book, it's clear what he thinks is a certain kind of chapter. And the centrality of practices of self here is something that I think is so striking that I needed to bring to us here today. This is the book that he considered ready to be edited. This is the book that was actually the final Foucault. And so for these reasons, I think it's important to situate these practices of the self in relation to Foucault's broader hopes and expectations for ancient ethics that constitute his own final analytic. So in this volume, we can gain glimpses of how new practices of self play an essential role in the relation between truth, desire, and pleasure in the constitution of a hermeneutic of self, in the formation of an ethic of the flesh, and in the genealogy of the man of concupiscence. Although Foucault doesn't give a full table of contents for this volume, he does leave indications. And so while this is rough, we're going to go through this very, very briefly. So Foucault had originally envisioned only a single volume on pagan antiquity, as he was calling it. This is basically the volume that he's writing that gives rise to his need to then continue making these splinter volumes, and volumes 2 and 3, as published, and even 4, end up basically co-opting certain aspects of this ethics volume on the particular works on sexual ethics. What we can note here, with apologies, is that he has these full volume drafts. So each one of these chapters are fully drafted. The first part is called The Art of Oneself. Chapter 1 is called The Culture of Self. Here we have a treatment on the Alcibiades. Then he moves to L'Âge d'Or, so it's the golden age of care of the self. He then moves to the conversion of self, which has a couple different principles. And then finally, the question of health. The second main part of the first part, Les Pratiques de Soi. So these practices of the self then have four folds: the esquisses, the exercises, examine, and the exercises of truth, or the experiences of truth. They're both part there. So each one of these chapters is focusing on some aspect of ancient ethics where the practices are foregrounded, whether he's thinking about the hypomenata, these practices of spiritual writing within the Stoic philosophers, or he's thinking through different dietary regimes in terms of an Aristotelian aspiration towards moderation. So they're very practical, everyday strategies that are really needed to be done, right, day to day. And so Foucault is attending to this question of esquisses as playing a fundamental role in the practices of self, how it organizes knowledge, principles, and rules for exercises of truth. He's also thinking about how this recours à soi, the return to self, the self-formation, the epistrophe, is a part of this practice. So values of mastering, of self-sovereignty, of self over self, tranquility of soul, and self-sufficiency are supported by an ensemble of methods, of procedures, and techniques. In a link to his History of Sexuality series, Foucault notes how the ethical experience which regulated the use of pleasure was the context for elaboration of a relatively fragmentary new moral. This new moral, he says, constitutes an art of living not imposed, but developed and conceptualized as a voluntary elaboration for a subject by himself. Far from an individualist application in private life, it's necessary to see a positive art of existence in a field of political and social relations partially renewed. So this is the second part. So this is the mess part. This is what I was just describing. But in the second part, Culture of the Self has all these different ways of thinking through the self-relation. And there, again, so many chapters and examples that are unfolded, deep textuality. And basically what Foucault is trying to come to is this way within which care of the self is a part of this golden age, right? The golden age where practices of the self are a part of an art of living. It's a permanent activity. It's one that you do with guides. It's one you do in community. It's one that helps structure your everyday life. Not in a compulsory way, but in a way that you yourself can stylize, take up, make into a regime, a form that we might assume to be a kind of renunciatory set of practices, for example, but that have that kind of ethos, that orientation towards a goal, the practices every day, a certain kind of principle of regulation, and particular sites of subjectivity that you get to work through and with over time. Well, so we have then Foucault framing the practices of self in relation to the first 2 centuries of our era in particular, where the theme of care of the self seems to have attained this golden age. In this golden age, quote, "The care of self is no longer simply a necessity imposed on ambitious young people who want to control the destiny of others." That was the case with Alcibiades in Foucault's reading. It's present, rather, as a universal rule for existence. So in principle, it extends to all. And in that chapter, the next chapter that Foucault writes, we see that earlier quotation. "We are under the power of another," he said, "but it is here where we must work on ourselves to intervene. We must protect ourselves from the inevitable misfortunes and become conscious that we are not reducible to the things that constitute our status." This raises the question of who precisely is called to invent their lives. Well, Foucault identifies a shift here. In box 72, he describes a transitional nature of care of the self in Plato's Alcibiades, where Alcibiades must care for himself in order to govern the citizens of Athens. Here, the epimelia hatu, the care of the self, is both indispensable and provisional for honing one's political art. For Romans of the High Empire, by contrast, the care of self of the epoch envisioned here appears intransitive. It finds in the self its proper objective and final goal, end quote. This generalization of the mechanisms present in the earlier Greek age extends such practices as applicable to all in the High Empire, at least in principle. What was an instrumental way of caring for self in order to govern others in Athens becomes self-care as an end in itself, no longer just for singular political rulers, but here's the catch, in principle extends to all, yet in practice is, of course, accessible to the philosophers who are surprisingly elite males. So, critiques of Foucault aside, he maintains or reincorporates chapters from his Government of the Self and Others into his other versions of the Confessions of the Flesh. So you can see here how the ways within which there's this overlap between one of his other volumes. Basically, he splinters these things out. He publishes his volumes on sexual ethics, and this last book on ethics languishes even more than Confessions of the Flesh, since it's still there. And yet this is what Foucault is coming to because he recognizes that sexual ethics is only one small part of ethics. And so his own insistence on sexuality as the seismograph of subjectivity that he takes from Peter Brown, the very idea that subjectivity in itself has to discover the secret sexual truth of one's desire, interests him less and less. So even though he's out there wearing a Speedo and having a wild time, he doesn't want to talk about sex, right? He doesn't want to theorize it. He wants to think about ethics as a more robust category, a more robust way of thinking about how to shape our lives in ways that offer challenges and contests to the dominant social norms at hand and the regulated ways of being that we are expected to take up and to make our own in order to become better and better good neoliberal subjects. So what Foucault is thinking through then is mastery as not autonomy. Instead, he's thinking about his critical analytic of subject formation while unfolding how subjects also have a relation to self and can critique the forms of social subjection through which they are shaped. Practices of self exceed the moderation and use of pleasure as part of a broader apparatus of ethics that might have even linked up to Foucault's final lectures on parrhesia as an ethos, in word, in deed, for how to shape oneself and courageously challenge systems of oppression. So to conclude, Foucault's work on the practices of self in antiquity is even more important than we could have imagined. We can see this in the BNF's archive form of a volume ready to be edited yet left incomplete. The tie between the epistemic, the governmental, and the ethical is of central importance for Foucault throughout his last decade, yet only becomes publicly available in his last 2 years, from 1982 to 4. In his last 4 years, however, we can see Foucault gradually recognizes that sexual ethics are only one part of ethics more broadly, particularly as he engages ancient forms of life. The more he researches the technologies of self in antiquity, the more they become allied with the practices of self and the possibility for challenging norms and social givens. In his final work, there is room for the intersection of noti satan, know thyself, and epimeleia hatu, care of the self, bringing together knowledge, truth, and subjectivity care. Charting different ways of life, these practices of self participate in the art of living, which opens up a twofold opportunity for Foucault. One, to identify how challenges to domination and changes to the socius are possible. And two, how government of the self relates to the government of others while challenging and contributing to this social change. I think that this clarifies the stakes, the ethical stakes for Foucault's own genealogy, as he identifies the rationalities deployed by modern power and the state's regulation of life and death. We see this so starkly today. To expose the mechanisms underpinning not only the practices of subject formation, but also the possibilities for resistance and critique within these very forms is vital. Foucault spends his last years developing the ethical force of what he comes to call a practice of freedom. Better grasping the importance of the history of Christianity to Foucault's genealogy requires we resist the temptation to read Confessions of the Flesh as Foucault's final word. After all, he refuses to complete his own diagnosis in Confessions by authorizing its publication. So too must we take up this final volume, Government of the Self and Others, as an opening instead of as an answer to final Foucault. The Christian book in the archives also reflects the rigor and scope and change Foucault allows his volumes and thought to undergo. Foucault's late work then invites robust engagement with both ancient histories of our present and forms of subjectivity. Yet I encourage us to both critique his own limitations within and beyond the domains he himself takes up and can see. He is, after all, limited by his own epistemic horizon from 40 years ago. What happens if we consider practices of self across the Silk Road? What happens when we consider technologies of self across analytics of domination, production, and signification? What happens when we understand hermeneutics to be interpretive strategies that link individual, historical, and cosmic forms through ritualized textual practices, and as the condition for the interiorization of subjectivity? In Foucault's own terms, how might we consider the question of what practices of self and arts of living offer for rethinking our own forms of life? And finally, how does this invite, even require, interdisciplinary collaboration to consider the constructions of other ways of being, other worlds through the instantiation of voices and practices that pose critical challenges to structures of domination? As I see it, these technical questions allow us to productively interrogate the great stakes of practices of self. Who gets to take up this challenge to invent our lives? And if we are privileged enough to be able to, what is the imperative to critically challenge the structures of violence that overdetermine the possibilities for too many others? Yes, we must invent our lives, as Foucault and Le Guin both intone. Yet forging practices of self as a critical practice requires challenging forms of governmentality and regimes of truth in order to forge the conditions for an art of living to become available to all, not only in principle, but also in practice. Thank you all. Thank you. We should thank our background music. Happy to take questions, clarifications. Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much. I love the talk, but especially I'm so grateful to you for delivering it under such weird circumstances. You did such an amazing job. I just suggest we thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
You must be exhausted and cognitively spent. This must require so much concentration. Could you just take us back to the contents of the work? So I was really struck, of course, when you read it, he starts with Alcibiades, who, of course, is a historical person. In antiquity is the very example of the opposite of self-control. Like he is the, if you take him either from a philosophical perspective as he's been taken or from the historical perspective, he's always like this bad example of a guy who showed so much promise and he had so much potential, and yet, as he's represented in ancient sources, through the lack of care for himself and self-control, he did terrible things. But of course, then you said it's Plato's Alcibiades that he talks about. And what's striking about that beginning, and that must be intentional on Foucault's part, is that later when Plato's thought becomes standardized and systematized, Neo-Platonist philosophers come up with an order in which you should read Plato. And Alcibiades is the first guy. So you should start with Alcibiades. And that, I think that must be, I think it's Iamblichus who who has the whole order, but that must be his note to Plato. Of course, I mean, Plato in the Alcibiades talks, Socrates talks with the young Alcibiades and tells him, if you don't take care of yourself, terrible things can happen. And of course, the readers by that time know terrible things did happen. So it's a sort of entry-level introduction to Plato's thought. But I think, Foucault knew his Plato extremely well, and that must be a nod to what's going on.
That is so helpful. I've been wondering why the Alcibiades, and I was wondering if this is something about the French educational system, but Iamblichus makes a lot more sense. So to repeat, the beautiful nugget here is the first part of the first chapter on Alcibiades, basically the party boy, right? He's really just a mess, but he's very beautiful. So of course, yeah, hot mess, exactly, hot in all senses. Yeah. So the way that the different dialogues of Plato, right, they're chronicled according to different years, but the way that Iamblichus, a Neoplatonist philosopher, is then going to say, read the Alcibiades dialogue first. which is so helpful to me because I really didn't understand why Foucault was fixated on the Alcibiades of all Plato's texts. And he has copious notes on Plato. He knows Plato very well. And the Alcibiades seemed kind of random. I think this might reflect, interestingly, on Foucault's own research practices, because the way in which he comes to some of his texts is twofold. It really starts with these very generic kind of dictionaries, like the Dictionnaire de Spiritualité de Beauchamp. You have the TD&T for the Antiers in here. Yeah, he actually uses Kittle's like Parisia entry. He has the entire copy. And so the Real Lexicon. So he's using these big encyclopedias to find different words, and then he looks at the sources, then he goes to the sources and take notes on the sources. His second way is to go through scholarly materials that are current at that time, but sometimes he's using 19th century scholarship too. He doesn't really differentiate very cleanly. And so the way then that he is culling his references from the footnotes of these secondary scholars, sometimes very dated, which then determines his own reading. So for Cassian, for example, he's relying on Owen Chadwick's 1950 volume, John Cassian. Foucault writes extensively from the Watkins 1928 History of Penance for his view on confession. And so I think that, like with Iamblichus, for example, like if Foucault is looking for a certain kind of term and finding within Iamblichus's order Alcibiades first, that might be not only an interesting nod, as you were suggesting, but also where Foucault maybe started and got stuck. So I'm very grateful. And if you have any other ideas, I'd love to know. Yeah, Sarah.
So I have another question for you, but I wanted to follow up on this a moment. I'm absolutely fascinated by the idea that Foucault was reading Iamblichus. What years do you think he was reading Iamblichus?
I don't think that he was actually reading Iamblichus.
Okay.
I think that he was using like dictionary entries where like suggestive parallels will come into being. And so maybe there was a reference from Iamblichus to Alcibiades that then related to some of the other material and the other terms that Foucault was looking up. Deeply speculative, but this is a part of his practice. And so you can trace this very cleanly in the archives because he's very good with his own note-taking. He gives the author, the title, the date of the edition he's using, the page numbers, the theme he's looking at. His Greek gets very good over time. His German gets worse. So like you can kind of see a lot of the different folds of his own thinking. And so I do not think that he actually read Iamblichus. I actually don't think that he has much on the Neoplatonists at all.
Okay, because it would have been hard to get a good edition even. But my real question for you, you said in passing that Peter Brown and Foucault affected one another. So I'm curious, can you tell me in a brief fashion, what do you think the effect on Peter Brown was?
Yeah, it's a very interesting and long answer that
Okay.
I actually have coming out with Foucault studies this month. So I can just give it to you.
Okay.
Because it took a while to figure out. So Chuck was, this is why I give the nod, Chuck was encouraging me to write the excellent adventures of Peter and Michel. And so I started this work in the archives in 2019, 2018, I forget. But COVID really got in the way. But when I was in the archives, there are these boxes that are marked as on the desk of Foucault, on the bedside table. And on the bedside table, there was a folder with 3 things. 2 of the things that Foucault had written before on confession, and then the third was a piece by Peter Brown on Augustine and sexuality. So I was trying to find out where this was from. And I found it on Peter Brown's academia.edu page. So I actually responded to that stupid what sparked my interest. And then he wrote me back. So it was hilarious. So then Peter and I started corresponding extensively because I wrote to him and saying, I'm sure you already know this, but I found it really moving that at the end of his life, he's also like directly reading your materials. I'd love to know A, what is it? When was it? And B, tell me more, tell me everything. So the ongoing relationship between the two of them led to a lot of different forms of influence. Peter Brown details this in A Life of Learning, where he is talking about very specific kinds of cultural and intellectual overlaps that they share, notably around questions of sexuality. Their readings of Augustine certainly diverge, and I wouldn't say that they have the same project at all, but the kind of overlaps when it comes to thinking about that particular line, right, when sexuality becomes a seismograph of our subjectivity, that Foucault really loved and took up from Peter Brown. And he cites this in his 1981 London Review of Books piece. And then he cites Peter Brown in the other piece that was the excerpt from Volume 4 on Cassian. But then Peter Brown falls out in Volume 4 as published. So he's kind of like the secret shadow figure in the background. And in terms of what Peter says he takes away from Foucault, it's not only this like broader genealogy of how to think through history, how to think about critical terms of subjectivity, how to think about practices and embodiment, but also in some ways, like Peter Brown has his autobiography coming out soon, where he details this in more vividness, but the being in California and participating in the kind of cult of the self, not that it was deeply individualist, but simply that like the bodies were different, right? People were doing their own thing. The possibilities seemed to be live. And I think that Peter was remarking on how both of them kind of took up this ethos from their own time at Berkeley. And I think that has also filtered out into his own work. So there are a number of different answers there. Sorry, I'm not more brief. But I'll give you the broader treatment because it is really fascinating how much overlap I think there ends up being that you only really find in secret little details in the archives. And that Foucault himself, for a variety of reasons, kind of obscures in his published work.
Thank you.
I think Chuck has a follow-up.
Oh, yes, please, Chuck.
Tanya?
Just a quick thing about
Oh,
that. Also, the new preface that Brown writes in Body and Society, the 25th anniversary of Body and Society,
Yeah.
which is a pretty extensive 25-page preface. He talks a bit there about how Foucault helped him he already knew those stuff, but also Aline Roussel stuff, and that actually altered the way Body and Society is in some ways a really significant change for the theoretical visibility of what Brown is doing. It feels like that's something that hanging out with Foucault, getting the permission.
Yeah. Thank you, Chuck. I think that's a perfect way to put it. Like Body and Society in particular is like the work that you can feel that influence, and one way in which you can chart the difference, for example. 1980, Peter Brown gives these lectures, the Hale Lectures at Seabury Western. He gives Foucault a copy of these lectures. It's called Monks and Philosophers. And this is, it's not published anywhere. The way in which Brown is citing Foucault in these Hale Lectures, right? He's saying, like, he's citing him on these constructions of sexuality, which were, pretty hot and new at that time. And then the difference between these, like, 1980 things when they actually meet, they exchange materials, and then Body and Society in 1989, right? It's come to fruition in a way that I think is really striking. Tanya?
I was curious to hear you talk a little bit more about what draws you to biography, which is what this seems to be, what the Cashin books seem to be. Because it's a different impulse than the historian's impulse or the anthropologist's impulse. It's a very, there are people who do this really, really well. And you're likely one of them. So I was just curious to hear you talk about the intellectual fascination and the experience of diving into somebody's life so deeply and what that means to you.
Thank you. That's a beautiful way of framing it, and I never put it in those terms. But it's true. I'm attracted to biography because I'm attracted to people who are trying to make sense of their lives and the messiness of it without trying to paint a single and static picture. I'm not interested in the heroes. I'm interested in the humans, and the humans who become heroes, certainly. But what are their struggles? What are their neuroses? What are their experiences? What are their practices? How are they getting through life? And in these two figures, with Cassian and Foucault, I think both of them are working with similar challenges, very different contexts, but similar questions of how do you shape your life? How do you shape your life in a way that hasn't been prescribed in advance? How do you shape your life in a way that allows you to transform? But also, how do you have enough empathy for yourself to know that transformation is not going to be a constant progress ascent. Instead, it's really messy, it's sloppy every day. There's backsliding, there's fighting, there are the negative affects, there are positive affects, there are demons, angels, there are all kinds of complexities. And this very porous self that I'm kind of working through, thinking through the way in which subjectivities are always related to others, always shaped by others. And yet, like as a, this is like the ballerina part coming out, I'm constantly trying to figure out how do we live in the most concrete ways when we can't trust our wills to guide us? What are the kinds of practices we can put in place that can help shape and forge a way of life whereby we can navigate every day?
What do you think those were for Foucault?
For Foucault, those practices?
Yeah, when you're describing this intellectual, I was going to do this and then I did that, and here's this, here's this chapter was here and that chapter was there. But I sense that you have a richer sense of his neurotic struggles. And I'd be curious to hear you talk.
Yeah, that's really the archival work. And I'm not trained in archival work. And so when I had the ability to go in like through the Foucault estate, and Liz Clark, who was an amazing mentor to me over the last 4 years, she really made that possible. And so being in the archives and just being with the precious work, I thought I would just kind of go in there and see his work on Cassian and make sure that his reading of Christianity checked out with my own critique. And instead, going through his own notes, it was just this process of, like reverence is the wrong word because it's not hero worship, but instead this kind of care. The kind of care, the kind of opening of the heart in which he defines parrhesia in Philodemus. I think it was that. It was this sense of being a part of a shared inquiry, of someone like being willing to reveal themselves in their own processes and to be there going through his own struggles, his own thoughts, his own revisions, his own excisions, his own exclamations, his journals as well, his intellectual journals, where we can see directly what he's reading, why, who referred it to him. There's one very personal entry in there. But I think it's part of the being in the archives. Lynn Huffer calls this like the erotics of the archive. I think of it more like in terms of like the experience of being present with this person who I feel like I know even though I don't. And so it's enough to want to do justice to the material, which makes me go into great depth in things that, I don't know, not many people would be willing to do, I guess. But to me, it allows me to make sense of not just his intellectual trajectory. And I think it's important because the centrality of Christianity there is something that's been so sidelined and is only really clear, in fact, by doing this intellectual work. And so I'm interested in intellectual biography for that reason. But I'm interested in his life too, and his own struggles, and the ways in which he's constantly open enough to revise and change and grow himself, that I think is a kind of exemplary scholar, intellectual thinker, parrhesiast. Is that getting closer?
Sure.
Yeah. I'll keep thinking.
That's great. Anyone else? Any questions or comments? Yes,
I
please.
have a question which might sound very simplistic after all of these, but and I ask this mostly because I haven't read a lot of Foucault, but I was curious to know what he thought the self is.
Yeah.
We spoke a lot about the practices, but whether his idea of what the self is changed over time.
No, it's like the money
I'm just
question.
going to repeat that
Yeah, please.
also so that I make sure I understood it. The question is essentially what Foucault understood the self to be?
Yeah, I think that's the money question. And it's the money question for us because Foucault comes from a very firm critique of the subject, and he's critiquing the subject within Marxism, the subject of phenomenology, and he's really affirming a different way of thinking, not about a stable and bounded and autonomous self, right, that he's going to cross out. He's going to cross out a cogito in Cartesian terms. And so he turns to subjectivity, like how do we shape forms of subjectivity? And he doesn't want to use the language of self at all because self was still like a deeply individualizing term, especially in his work on power. It's not the self. He says, the soul is the prison of the body because the soul has been constructed vis-a-vis these different disciplinary techniques. So the self is not a principle of self-identity within those domains of power. And I think that when he comes to thinking through practices of self, he never actually just not never actually. He very rarely talks about the self because he doesn't think there's a self, right? Like subjectivity is it's deeply porous, it's changing, it's relational, it's more like Deleuze and assemblage. And so there is no fixed entity, and that's why he very rarely says like le soi, the self. And instead, it's about the practices, right? Like practices of self, relations of self, technologies of self. And so the practices through which selves are constituted. And at least in my reading, this is what I find so powerful about his practices of self, because it's the ways in which we relate to ourselves, even though there's no single hypostatic self, and instead the self in itself is a relation, right? It gets very Kierkegaardian. What is a self? The self is a self, it's relating itself to itself. He's making fun of Hegel, but still, right? Like there are these very long conversations about what the self is, and Foucault is both rejecting those conversations while reinscribing its subversive potential. I'll keep thinking though.
Yeah, please.
But only that no one else has a question. Yeah, please.
Do you think his really intense research and writing might have been like a practice of self?
Absolutely.
A therapeutic,
Yeah. And I think that you bring up a really important distinction, right? Like, how do we think about practices of self? Are they always therapeutic? It depends on what we mean by therapeutic. Sonam's example of that passage yesterday in terms of self-examination, right? And how the careful examiner is also a doctor for minds. I think this is a really interesting way, and I'd love to actually know what Sarah and Tanya have to say about this. But thinking with Cassian, for example, who is diagnosing the origins of these basically demonic spirits, basically dangerous temptations, the origins and the therapies. Right? He's trying to figure out how do we cope with what are very real and present. And I think for Foucault, he's trying to forge a way of life in and through these practices. And sorry, I should have said the question. The question is, was Foucault's own research practice a care of the self, a practice of the self as a therapeutics? And I think that if we think about care of the self and practices of the self as a way of shaping one's life, shaping that kind of ethos in word and deed, and that is a therapeutic practice of kind of the medicine for having to live, or the medicine of how we live, and then medicine of how we live in relation to each other and also contribute to something that can change, I would say absolutely. And I think it's a really nice way of thinking through it. He was so disciplined. Yeah.
Sonam, please.
Thank you. Well, thank you.
Now they stop.
Now
they stop.
Now they stop. But I wanted to say if anyone could have pulled it off. Right, so well done. Okay, I was struck by something Ivana said, introducing Sarah's talk. And this is in connection to Sarah's project, to tell the Greek myths for audiences today, right? And something about Foucault's lectures and his seminar notes that has always struck me is how forceful and vivid a reader he is, and how much he conveys of the power of reading and encountering ancient works. So I guess this is connected, and I'd love to hear all of our speakers, their thoughts on this. What is it about Foucault's encounter, like workman-like encounter with these texts, primary texts, almost philologically, right? That is allowing him to say and feel and experience things about these practices, that is lost in these other sorts of scholarly, particularly the French philosophical mode of essay writing and concealing one's actual intent or communications and elusiveness, and you know where I'm going, right? Foucault the writer is very different from Foucault the reader sometimes. And I'd love to hear about these. What do we gain when we encounter these primary sources in the way that late Foucault allows us to see? And I think Peter Brown talks about this too, right? That this is something that impressed him, that we don't see this other way. And it's an honest question. It's not like a theoretically savvy thing. Like, what do you think we can learn from him?
No, I think this is precisely the formulation I've been most captivated by from other speakers, which is how do we take something that's descriptive and make it our own? Like, what is the nature of that investment? And why is it that Foucault becomes invested in these ancient texts? And maybe to Tanya's question, why am I invested in Foucault's texts? And I think there's that sense of being a part of a shared project, that sense of, at least in my reading of how Foucault comes to these figures, he's really like, why did I start reading early Christian ascetics? Right? It's because there's this intensity and integrity, that there's this sense of like a real searchingness. I couldn't deal with the doctrinal materials, but they were still really trying to figure out like incarnational like aspects of how, Christ can be constituted, and there were real stakes. And I think that's at least part of what I always try to communicate to my graduate students in the theory and methods classes. Like, as dry and as dull as Kant may be on the page, he's also dealing with real stakes. All the figures that we're reading and engaging have these questions, and I think that when you say, like, what is the distinction then between like the French form and then Foucault as researcher, as I put him, when thinking about him in the archives. And I think that like Foucault as researcher has that openness. He's willing to make things his own. He's willing to engage in this kind of hermeneutics of openness to the process of learning and learning from, in the spirit within which he himself is coming to the archive. He allows the text to speak to him. And this might just be my own imposition, but that's at least what draws me to that kind of practice as well.
I have a short follow-up. Sorry, did someone else?
Oh, no.
No, please.
Does this, okay, so these are not formulated questions. Do you see this in the scale of his attention? In these, like, the fact that he's going line by line, or, I'm sorry. Would it, and this is again for you too, Sarah, you're translating and repurposing and rethinking and crafting line by line. Does the scale of one's object of study or concern or focus shift anything about the way in which these materials speak to us or affect us? And we're in a room full of classicists and philologists too, so I cede the floor to my betters and elders.
Well, I should do the same.
No.
I think that question of scale is interesting with Foucault, because I think for him, the more that he writes on a particular person, the more he's trying to figure something out. And oftentimes it's something that countervenes his originary assumption. So his folder on Augustine, for example, has 144 pages. There are very meticulous notes on Augustine from across 19 different texts in Augustine's work. And I think that he's trying to figure out, how is this not the Augustine of the Confessions that he knew, and instead all these other different ways of thinking about the debitum conjugale, like the different ways of thinking through like the juridical nature of sexual relations. So that's one example. And then the scale in a very different register, looking at his student notes from the 1950s when he was a graduate student, he has these massive folders on Husserl, like this much on Husserl. I couldn't even try. But, and he also has an entire box. Box 33 is all about Heidegger. So the scale, I think, is a part of not just like what he was forced to actually consume, but this questioning where he's trying to go and search, maybe in like a Heraclitean sense, like of himself.
Okay, so I'm both impressed by the scale, but also by the fact that he kept his notes.
Yeah.
What was going on with that? What was he going to do with them?
So somebody asked earlier, right, like why now? Why did this volume come out? And part of the answer is that he had written this letter when he had gone to Poland to fight for solidarity with Lech Walesa, pas de publication posthume, right, like no posthumous publications. And so this was interpreted as his will, which is how they had kept most of his materials under lock and key. And so if he's really that opposed to posthumous publications, why did he keep all of that? 40,000 pages of materials in the archives, in the one beanie. I know. So I think this has turned into like psychiatry hour of me and Foucault and how we're both like, but I similarly like the saving of things, the protecting, the knowing that you can pull them in at any moment. I really can't speak to his own practice and why he kept everything over time, but I can say that in terms of something that's like personal instead of academic, where like I have that kind of like hoarding and protective mentality because I want to keep all of my friends around, like all the prior voices even, and all the different notes.
I mean, that's actually deeply interesting. There's tendencies in this direction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a really interesting question. What does it mean to have the artifact? What does it mean to keep the photograph? Not to throw out your, like some people sensibly will go through their photographs and throw out the ones that didn't work. Some people don't. Some people save all their notes. Some people don't. Some people save all their drafts. Some people don't. Some people save, they want physical, the physical thing, and it's something concrete about knowledge,
Yeah.
what it means to hold knowledge, or what it means to experience, to collect memory.
Mm.
And I think for my dad, he wanted to keep memory close. It counted as real if it was
Yes.
physical. So I think that's a real interesting question to ask about.
I think that last phrase, it counted as real, is one that resonates with me deeply. I think that keeping them around is really about staying in connection to realities. I think with Foucault, to think about him just as a researcher and as academic, he also was constantly using his materials. And so they were not just relics. Instead, they were, I don't know, more like tulpas, right? He's like manifesting them, he's bringing them into their own, maybe not tulpas, but like his dinner party has grown. So he has a lot more people at the table. And I can relate to that.
But do you have any evidence that he went back to that box on Heidegger?
Oh, well, I don't know about the Heidegger as such, because I haven't looked at that particular box. But with the other materials, for example, like the Cassian, he has notes that were originally in the Cassian folder, I imagine, but that are now all over the archives. So in his Les Œuvres de la Chair, he has 3 boxes on that. He has 2 full boxes on that second volume, La Chair et le Corps, and you find Cassian throughout there. So you do see him actually, like the relics of the different notes being shuffled around. And it's not just Cassian by any means. So Heidegger, I think that he has a weird relationship with and kind of obscures his own relationship to.
I was just questioning whether the collection
Mhm.
was for the sake of collection,
Right.
and how much of it was actually being actively used. Because often people who
Oh,
collect,
yeah.
they want to have it,
Yeah.
they don't necessarily want to use it.
Yeah. Well, it's like a security blanket, right? Like, why do we keep our friends around? Why do we keep? Oh, no, no, no. But
There's a difference between a box, a big box of notes and Heidegger and a friend.
no, I mean my friends. Like, no. They're real, Tanya. They're real. So, like, right, like this level of needing the materiality, because it not only makes the thoughts and ideas real, but it makes it so that I can engage it, or like the tactility of it, the way of engaging it, like my note-taking style. Everything has to have a deeply embodied element, and one that is constantly retraining me to like enter back into its world. And so that language that you used to, it counted as real for your father. I think that at least for me, like my office is a mess because I refuse to throw anything away. Also because I just have all these ideas here that I haven't been able to sort through. I would like to at some point sort through them, get rid of the stuff that's garbage. I mean, it's all probably garbage, but I also kind of need evidence that I'm alive in some way. Just like these like continuities over time, a sense of my own like development, the ways within which there are so many ways in which I'm thinking exactly the same thoughts, I think, but in such different ways, in such different contexts.
Even the photos, there was one photo of him sitting behind those stacks of paper in his office,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
But they were not messy.
That's pretty messy.
No.
Yeah, so like a box, that's a box,
This is a
fold.
very interesting way to answer Amun's question. What did Foucault, well, there's what did he think of oneself, but there's also how he enacted, like, right?
yeah, that the production of knowledge was material
Yeah.
as well.
Production himself.
This is why it would be really good to have like Daniel Defer here, Philippe Chevalier, like the people who also knew Foucault directly and could speak to the man more directly. Like my Foucault the researcher is very much an imagined Foucault, but it's on the basis of the material evidence and the artifacts and my own experience of it. And so maybe my own like biographical impulse is one to put myself in continuity with other people's lives because it gives my own life more reality. I don't know. It's really psych hour now. Yeah, Chuck.
So this is a larger issue about scholarly identity and where your scholarly self is.
Yeah.
Is it on paper or other things? And in some forms of Tibetan Buddhism, one of the big insults is you have your learning in a box, right? In other words, you have your learning in the text, the written texts, in that way, not in the mind. And it feels to me like the example I think of is a guy from Chicago, Michel Foucault, who at the very end of his life, he had developed a very extensive library. Very famous kind of historian of religion and politically very complicated dude. But at the end of his life, his library burned. And in his diaries, he writes about this as the death of a certain kind of self.
Yeah, right.
And it's a which is why everyone should double back up everything they have.
Only if you're a hoarder. Right? Yes, Sarah.
It didn't all disappear. Some of the books survived, but they were smoke damaged, and he threw the doors open to his graduate students, one of whom was a former colleague of mine and went in and got a bunch of books and gave one to me, so I have a book that belonged to Eliada. So they are damaged, but they're still physical. And I have to say that one reason I prize this book is because it's got that history. It's got the smoke on it and the water damage from when they put out the fire.
The artifact.
Yes.
Relic.
Yeah, it's a relic.
And somewhat sentient.
Yes.
And that's just kind of interesting.
Yes,
Yeah.
so the thing that the class is gonna go to next, after the sequence of works that you guys have provided us, is on this question of extruded minds. And ways in which, like, things that we used to think with or feel with, wherever located, whether they're inside of us or out of us, can be counted as minds.
Which goes back to the Varela point, because this copy of Francisco Varela's Italian lectures, like I just copied an annotate. I was like deep. Myself was in the book, and so when I left it on the airplane, I literally felt this sense of loss, like grief, because it was not only like what did I think, but also like how was I thinking through this? Like it actually did have its own kind of extendedness, which I think corresponds well to what Varela is talking about in terms of embodied cognition. Right, our cognition does not happen in our heads. Interior experience is never just interior. We're always embodied, extended, and engaged in these ways that totally exceed any kind of boundedness.
Perhaps this is a little bit of projection, but something that I personally relate to, Foucault being someone who's so interested in self-transformation, keeping a history of your past selves and what your past selves thought as a way that you continually in dialogue with past versions of yourself that you can no longer actively remember, that's no longer who you are now, but you can be in conversation with those past versions of yourself by keeping those documents of what you thought then, that in a way that I don't think you can do to get rid of that ever. That you don't have that capacity for going back and talking with yourself from the new perspective now that I personally relate to very much.
Yeah, I think that goes to a really interesting point about the kind of talking back and the voices, and just talking about Evagrius yesterday. Right, so Evagrius is saying, well, when the demons come, like this is how you throw like different scriptural lines at them, right? This is how you talk back to them. But this is not an adversary, but a friend. Right? How do you talk back to yourself when you know that the conditions for any of our own experience are going to be so presentist? And so how do you have a conversation with yourself? If not through this, this artifact or this relic of, and the evidence that you were yourself different. I think that's a very nice way of thinking about the conversational aspect of the archive. Like the kind of sentience of the archive is now seeming increasingly creepy. It's more like horror story domain now. It's like Foucault's archive is the blob, right, taking on its own life. But also it has like this vitality and the ascription of value, right, on analog to the ascription of vitality or sentience, I think does increase its relevance, its liveness, our own investment in it, our own connection to the power, as so many have said, that it might hold for us.
That's fabulous. We're going to conclude with that. Thank you one more time for
Thank
Professor
you.
Clements.
Thank you. Thank you.
Possible round of applause for all our speakers.
And to Sonam Kashu, the mastermind. Thank you all for being here, for bearing with us, for bearing with the Foucault.